All right, hello everyone. My name is Ephraim Katsir, and on behalf of Sephardic Heritage International in DC, or SHIN DC, welcome to today's talk to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Farhud, Baghdad and beyond, Iraqi Jewish history in the 20th century, moving beyond the stereotypes. Today's speaker is our wonderful friend and colleague, author, Dr. Sasha Goldstein-Sabbah. I would like to thank Sephardic Heritage International's co-hosts for today's event, Tiferet Israel Congregation in Washington, D.C., CUNY, City University of New York, Brooklyn College, and Harif, Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, based in the UK. We have a truly international audience today, including some from Baghdad. Please do let us know where you're joining us from in the chat. I will now turn the program over to our moderator, Maurice Shohet, who gave a fantastic talk about the Farhud for our program last year. We encourage you to listen to the recording of that talk as well. Moderator Maurice Shohet is managing editor of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's Arabic language website, president of World Organization of Jews from Iraq, and a Sephardic Heritage International in DC board member. Maurice is also an Iraqi Jew born and raised in Baghdad. His personal family history is represented in the Iraqi Jewish archives. Over to you, Maurice.
Thanks, Ephraim, and good afternoon, good evening to some of you. It's really a pleasure to participate in this 80th anniversary commemoration of the Farhud that occurred on Chag HaShavuot, the Shavuot holiday, on June 1st and 2nd, 1941. It started in the 30s when envoys of Nazi propagandist Goebbels arrived to Baghdad to spread charges that the Jews conspired to dominate the country. And second phase was when Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, was translated into Arabic and distributed in Iraq. Obviously, as many of you know, in the period of 1936 to 1939, there was Arab revolt in Palestine, and during that period, several Jews were killed in Baghdad. In 1941, there was a period where pro-Nazi government was established in Baghdad, headed by Rashid Ali al-Gailani. Then he was ousted, and there was some kind of chaos in the Iraqi capital. And on Chag HaShavuot, the Shavuot holiday, what came to be known the Farhud started. And the word Farhud refers to the mass killing and looting carried out against some Jews in the Iraqi capital. I have to mention in this context that there were many Jews that were protected by their neighbors. Among them, my mother's family. My mother was still single at the time, and one of her neighbors took her family, all of the brothers and sisters, and her parents. And they stayed there for 36 hours at his place. And when the mob came to attack, the Muslim neighbor's security shoot in the air and scared the attackers. So thanks to many of those Iraqi Muslim families, many Jews were saved. And now back to the book of Dr. Sasha Goldstein-Sabbah. As she wrote in it, I'm quoting, that her study focuses primarily on the position of Iraqi Jewry during the rise of Arab nationalism in the 20th century, and therefore analyzes the legacy of Jewish internationalism for Iraqi Jewry. I read the majority of the book, and it's really fascinating. I thank Dr. Goldstein-Sabbah for her book. Other than that, please join me to welcome Dr. Sasha Sabah and to her lecture. Please.
Oh, okay. I guess everyone can hear. First, thank you for that lovely introduction, Maurice, and thank you so much to Shin DC for inviting me to talk a little bit about my research. And I'm delighted to see so many people online listening. I thought everyone was sick of Zoom, but so I'm even more grateful. Obviously, this talk is very much in the context of thinking about the Farhud 80 years later. And I'm going to start my talk by saying we can't reduce the history of Jews in Iraq to the Farhud. It is one event, and we can learn about it, and I'll discuss it a little bit more in a wider context at the end of my talk. But what I'm hoping my talk will inspire everybody listening to do who doesn't know so much about Iraqi Jewry is to read more about the history of Iraqi Jewry, because it's a fascinating history, and it certainly merits more study. I teach, and when I teach students, a lot of them don't know anything about the history of Jews from the Islamic world at all. And this is my favorite picture to start with. And you don't have to know anything about the history of the Middle East even to appreciate it. But what I'll tell you, although I don't always tell my students, is that it's a picture of the Jewish Alliance Israélite Universelle Girls' School in 1928. It's the Laura Kadoorie School. And you look at the girls, and what do you think when you look at these girls, right? Just take a look at these beautiful, confident, educated young women who are looking straight in the picture, and the way they're dressed in very modern fashion, and they're eating a meal together. I think it's kube, but we can discuss what they're actually eating perhaps. And we can see also the back sign, and it says Entraide Scolaire. It was an organization where wealthier girls from the school and girls who are in the more vocational trend at the atelier would come together, and they would cook, and it would assure that all girls would get at least one square meal a day. And it would also bring girls from different social strata together. But what's interesting is that in this picture, you really see all of the cultural influences that the Iraqi Jewish community in the 20s, 30s, and 40s was part of. You see the sign that's in French. You see the fashion, which is very European, of course, but you also see that they're making traditional Iraqi food as well. And some of the girls have, traditional gold jewelry on. And so it shows in a way that the Jewish community of Iraq could at the one time be very, very modern, and at the same time could also very much be part of Iraqi society and very proud of their traditions as members of Iraqi Jewry, but also as members of the larger Iraqi society. So I always think when you think about Iraqi Jewry, to think about these young, confident women in their school in the heart of Baghdad. But what's interesting, I guess, a little bit of pretext, I'm going ahead of myself in my slide, sorry. My book and my research looks very much at how Iraqi Jews saw themselves within the wider Jewish world in this period. And the reason my book looked at that is because there are lots of other amazing books on Iraqi Jewry, and they generally look at two themes. One looks at how Iraqi Jews were part of a wider Iraqi Arab society. And they've really shown how Iraqi Jews participated in the society, and as Orit Bashkin says, practiced Arab Jewishness. They wrote in Arabic, they enjoyed Arabic cinema, they performed music with their friends. And so we now know how deeply ingrained Iraqi Jews were within Iraqi society. And we have other books that look at the relationship between Iraqi Jews and Zionism. which is separate from the rest of the Jewish world. But my question really was, when we think about these girls, they were in a Jewish school that used a curriculum which was decided in Paris. How did they position themselves as Jews? Did they see themselves as having, their co-religionists in Europe or in other parts of the Middle East or perhaps in America? And I think this question is really interesting when we look at how Iraqi Jewry developed in the 19th and evolved in the 19th and early 20th century. And if we really want to understand Iraqi Jewry, we need to understand how this Arab Jewishness worked kind of with this transnational Jewishness. And that's what I hope we can talk a little bit about today. But thinking about Iraqi Jewry, one of the important things to think about is that the Jews of Iraq were the original diaspora community. And what do I mean by that? Well, a lot of times we think about Jewish communities as immigrant communities, but the Jewish community of Iraq dates from the exile. This is the lieu of the Babylonian Talmud. In the 12th century, when Benjamin Tudela is traveling through the Middle East, he talks about 40,000 Jews in Baghdad with 28 synagogues and 10 yeshivot. I think he's overestimating a little bit, and most other scholars agree, but there is a continuity of Jewish life, right? There are important shrines there. And so in the 19th and 20th century, even when there are moments of tension between the Jewish community with other religious communities in Iraq, they're still seen as being a historic community of Iraq. They're still seen as being part of the fabric of society. And that's very important because that is not the case in other areas of the Middle East, of Europe, and certainly beyond. So where does our story kind of begin if we look at this flourishing cosmopolitan 20th century society? And it really begins in the 19th century with a mixture of what we can call kind of a local modernization, Ottoman reforms to improve infrastructure, thinking about education, but also giving Jews new rights. They're no longer dhimmis, they're a millet, they're a religious community with certain rights. And then external influences, primarily from Jewish organizations, the Alliance Israélite Universelle and the Anglo-Jewish Association, which were organizations that wanted to combat anti-Semitism on a global scale through uplifting Jewish communities, not just in the Middle East and North Africa, but also in Eastern Europe. And with Jews traveling to Iraq, they learn about these different initiatives. And of course, educated Jews in Iraq read Hebrew. They were reading newspapers of the Haskalah, so they knew about these initiatives. And I think it's in 1862, I'd have to go back to my documents, you have 4 members of the Jewish community who write to the Alliance in Paris, and they say, we hear you've opened a school in Tétouan, which is in northern Morocco. Could you help us do the same thing in Baghdad? And they do, and they open the first school to teach secular subjects in Iraq for, of course, Iraq is part of the Ottoman Empire at this point. It's 3 provinces. The provinces are Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. And they open additional schools. And in 1889, they opened the first girls' school in Iraq as well. And these schools are so successful that while the Muslim and Christian communities are developing their own schools, lots of Christian and Muslim elites send their children, in fact, to the Jewish schools so they can get an education. So if we look at society, and in the US we talk about school integration, well, this is a way from children from a very young age to meet with others who they might not come in contact with their daily life. So this really lays the groundwork. And then in addition to that, with the expansion of the British Empire, some Baghdadi Jews, and I usually refer to Iraqi Jews as Baghdadi Jews, they go to India. And if you see the picture on the lower right-hand corner, that's of the Sassoon dynasty. And they become very wealthy and successful, and they expand their trade network to Singapore, to Shanghai, and to Hong Kong. But they see life in Baghdad as being eternal, Jewish life, right? It's little Jerusalem. And so they continue to invest in the infrastructure by building schools and hospitals and synagogues. And so you have this vibrant Baghdadi diaspora, which emerges. And it's not unidirectional. People might move abroad or move to Manchester and then come back and move back and forth. So while very much remaining Iraqi, they also become international, and they also become integrated into larger Jewish networks. So if we get to the 20th century, in the 1920s, 25% of the population of Baghdad is Jewish, is part of the Jewish community. And that will decline in the 30s and 40s only because there's additional migration from rural areas of non-Jews to Baghdad. But we can really think of Baghdad in the 1920s and 30s and 40s as a Jewish city. And in 1924, the Iraqi constitution grants citizenship to all Iraqi Jews. So they're full citizens. There are spots in the parliament for Iraqi Jews. The first minister of finance is a Jewish man. And the Jewish community, who has very strong ties to these transnational Jewish networks I mentioned briefly, continues to work with them. But as they have multiple generations of students who are educated in secular schools, who have studied in Iraq and abroad, they also take back a lot of their communal organization. And by 1928, the administration of the Jewish school system, which by then I think has around 15 schools, and it will go up to somewhere in the mid-30s by the 1940s, is taken over anew by the community. And what's interesting there is that although they depend on some guidance from London and from Paris, they also make their own decisions, and they say, we need to adjust our curriculum because it's important to speak Arabic, because we are Iraqi citizens, and Arabic is the language of our country, and it's the language of our home. So the schools are often bilingual in French and Arabic for girls, and in English and Arabic for boys. But you see this balance between in Iraqi nationalist sentiment and pragmatism, but also this eye towards the international, both from a Jewish cultural perspective, but also from a commercial perspective. And by the 1920s and 30s, about 65% of the Jewish community of Iraq is squarely within the middle class as well. So they work in the civil service, they work as teachers, as doctors, they teach in important institutions, and they are very much part of this new, vibrant Iraqi society, which is full of hope for the future in the post-Ottoman world. Within this, and what's very important for this within the Iraqi Jews, and this is what I find fascinating, is that this is very much dependent on these transnational Jewish connections. So as I said before, you have these Jews in places like India and Shanghai, and they're communicating back and forth with Baghdad. Some, you've heard the term mail order bride. Sometimes women will move out to the satellite communities to marry men. And then you also have Jews from all of these places going to Europe. And so you have this kind of triangle between Asia, Iraq, and Europe. And you have exchanges of ideas, you have exchanges of newspapers. If we look at the libraries of the Jewish schools in Baghdad, they're getting Jewish newspapers from London, from Paris, from New York, from Seattle. And we know that students and teachers are reading in them and they're writing in them. And although the philanthropic organizations are still providing expertise by way of teachers, by way of doctors, they're providing political support through moments of tension and certainly financial aid, you also begin to see that Iraqi Jews are offering aid to their co-religionists in other parts of the Middle East, in Eastern Europe. And so they're seeing themselves as part of a larger Jewish network, and they're seeing themselves as having benefited from this larger network, and now wanting to do the same when they're in a position to aid Jews around the world. And what I think is the most interesting is that the rabbinate in Baghdad, which in many ways is very conservative politically and very careful, they begin to use foreign rabbis to assume their legitimacy as well. So in the late 1920s, there's an offshoot Jewish group in Basra, which is in southern Iraq, and it's a theosophy society, and it starts out as this intellectual society, and there are discussions about whether it's blasphemous or not. I won't get into it here. I guess you could read my book, or there's some other good articles I suggest. But what's interesting is that, first of all, the chief rabbi in Baghdad, he lets this happen until this Theosophy Society starts butchering their own meat. And why is this? Because now it's not just a question of ideas, but the gabel, the tax on kosher meat, is not going to the chief rabbi anymore. So he gets involved because this is really seen as undermining the community. But getting back to my whole point about these transnational networks, he doesn't speak with other community leaders to affirm his position. He does that, but in addition to that, he writes to rabbis in London and in New York who aren't necessarily Sephardi or Baghdadi or Halabi, for example. He writes, in addition to that, to Ashkenazi rabbis, and he asks them for letters backing him up in his position. So we really see here how Iraqi Jews were citizens, they were part of Iraqi society, and yet they were kind of global Jewish citizens as well, and they worked between these multiple networks. So when we think about the Iraqi Jewish experience, I always say, again, when I speak with Americans, is I think when you think about how people thought about themselves in the world, politically, from a religious perspective, it's good to think about your Thanksgiving table. And some people politically are a little bit towards the right, and some people are a little bit more politically towards the left. Some people are more religious, some people are less religious, but they're all one family. And that shows that there was a certain confidence in the Iraqi Jewish society, and that people felt free to have these differing opinions. So we can't say that all Iraqi Jews adopt this nationalist sentiment, but many, of course, do. And those who are members of the communal elite, they're communal leaders, presidents of the Jewish community, of organizations, but they also hold positions in parliament, important positions in the civil service, and they're also part of transnational Jewish networks holding positions in important charities as well. And this isn't seen in being in conflict in any way. And the socioeconomic mobility of the Iraqi Jewish community, particularly in the 1920s and 30s, really further cements this idea of permanence for Iraqi Jews. And the idea of being Jewish and being active on a transnational Jewish level and being an Iraqi citizen who speaks Arabic and who enjoys Arab culture was never seen as being a conflict. It was seen as being a boost. And certainly from Iraqi society, that there was this vibrant, educated middle class was seen as being uplifting, and their transnational Jewish connections were seen as being beneficial. And if we look at kind of an ambivalence towards Zionism, well, I think that makes sense, because if your community is flourishing, you're not looking to go somewhere else. You're not looking for protection. You're looking at building your local community. And we see this through these networks, through India and through China, where they're building Iraqi society. So now if we kind of circle back to the Farhud in 1941, the Farhud is a terrible act of violence against the Jewish community of Baghdad. But some scholars have suggested that it kind of represents the worst of Iraqi Jewish history and the best. And why is that? Because of what Maurice said, right? That Jews were killed, their properties were damaged, there was looting, but many Muslims also protected their neighbors and supported their neighbors. And after the Farhud, the government recognized the violence. They compensated the community. It wasn't commensurate with the amount of damage and the loss of life, but they compensated the community, and they worked to improve the situation and address the unease of the Jewish community. And now, most recent scholars on the Iraqi Jewish history, we've shown that in the years of, 43, 44, 45, 46, Jewish life in Iraq improved tremendously. And the Farhud was not the beginning of the end. If anything, what happened in the years directly after reaffirmed the position of Jews in Iraq. And I would also invite you to think about this in the context of 1941, and that Iraqi Jews know what's going on in Europe. They know about Kristallnacht. And in comparison to Germany, the government recognizes the violence and they say, no, you are citizens and this is a shame on our society and we need to make amends. So we need to see this example of the Farhud and remember it. But we also need to see it within kind of the complexity of the Iraqi Jewish experience. So thank you for listening to my little introduction, and I look forward to having a discussion with Maurice and answering some questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thanks, Sasha, for your wonderful lecture. It's really very enlightening. I just have a couple of questions before I ask Ephraim to take over. When the Alliance Israélite Universelle came to Iraq, if I am not mistaken, in 1864, they established the first boys' schools in Baghdad. It's hard to grasp that a society that is controlled by rabbis, when there was yet no lay council, it was only established, if I am not mistaken, in 1870. How did the rabbi were open to the idea of having Western education to be introduced to the society? Do you have some kind of thought?
Yeah, sure, it's a great question. So the first Alliance school is not organized on a communal level because, as you correctly noted, there is no lay council in 1864. But we have salons where people discuss ideas of the Haskalah and modernity within a Jewish context. And the first school grows out of that. And the rabbis are very concerned. And they're concerned about this idea of Western education, of course, but they're also concerned about their authority being undermined. And so there's a delicate balance between this question of rabbinic authority and secular authority, or let's say lay authority, which we'll see throughout the arc of Iraqi history. And the first school will actually close, and then it will reopen a couple years later. And what's really funny is in the archives, you see the students writing to the Alliance in Paris, and they're saying the rabbis are trying to close our school. Please get the French consul in Baghdad to convince the rabbis not to close our school. And the students really believe that the French consul is powerful enough to go against the rabbis of Baghdad. And I guess they were a bit disappointed to learn that the French consul was not all powerful. Maybe that's the influence of French education, that they thought the French were more powerful than they actually are. But what really ends the debate, shall we say, is that you have the Rabbi Abdallah Somech, who's a very important Iraqi rabbi, and he makes the decision to send his children and grandchildren to the Alliance school. And he says, you can raise your children to be religious, Torah-observant Jews, and that secular education is only going to enhance their knowledge. And so let's say by the 1880s, the debate is over. And of course, you have the yeshivot in Baghdad, Yeshiva Zilcha, for example, which continue flourish is a difficult word, but certainly which continue to exist and slowly but surely integrate more and more secular subjects. So that by the time we get to the 1920s, even the students who go to the yeshivot are learning some very basic English and some basic maths and science.
Obviously, the Alliance School helped the Jewish community when the British took over in 1917, in 20th century, and members of the community were able to work with the new administration, with the new British law. The second and last question that I have, your book and many, if not all the communities in the Far East from Iraqi descent refer to themselves as Baghdadi Jews. I personally, who was born and raised in Baghdad, I never referred to myself as such, but Iraqi Jew. is the reason for those communities to call themselves Baghdadi Jews have anything to do with a class? Is it a class issue, or because Iraq was not yet a country in the 19th century, or even earlier, those earlier immigrants from the community in Baghdad, while there was also a successful community, for example, though very small, in Basra, and less successful, of course, in northern Iraq. So would you able to refer to this point?
Yeah, sure. So it's a fantastic question. And the first thing I would say is that in the archives, you see Baghdadi or Iraqi Jews refer to themselves in multiple ways. They use the term Baghdadi, they use the term Iraqi, they use the term Mesopotamian, and they use the term Babylonian. And sometimes it also depends on language, of course. Bavli, for example, it depends on language. You touched on a couple of important points. One is that the Baghdad community and the Basra community saw themselves as being one community. And by saying Baghdadi, they were making a clear statement that they weren't part of the northern Iraq Neo-Aramaic speaking community, which some people refer to as Kurdish Jews, although they don't speak Kurdish, so it's not quite correct. There are two other reasons. One is that after 1917, especially, a lot of Jews outside of Iraq renounce their Iraqi citizenship because they're British citizens or British protected people. So they don't really want to call themselves Iraqi anymore. But when they begin to refer themselves as Baghdadi, they're referring to themselves in the sense of their religious traditions. So it becomes less a statement about nationality and more a statement about minhag, for example, or nusakh. And so it takes on that double role. So a little bit is about class, and a little bit about it has to do with the way Jews describe themselves within Jewish communities. And within that, even so some of the Baghdadis, you'll see at a later stage, they begin to refer to themselves as being Sephardic. And of course, their families don't have any connection to Spain, but on a larger global scale, they identify more with the world Sephardic community than they do with, say, different strands of Ashkenaz or different groups such as, Egyptian Jewry, for example. And so we see certainly in Shanghai and in London, Jews of Iraqi origin beginning to refer to themselves even as Sephardic, which is really interesting.
Thank you very much for your enlightening answers. I would like now to ask Ephraim Katsir to take over and probably open the conversation to others if he sees fit. Ephraim?
All right. Thank you so much, Maurice, and thank you so much, Sasha. Since you were just talking about it a little bit, in terms of the networks you were talking about, I know some people are interested to know a bit more about the ways in which Baghdadi Jews came to see themselves as part of the global Spanish and Portuguese community, and what kinds of contact or correspondence was there that might have been part of that perspective.
Okay, so this is something that we've certainly spoken about before. I mean, Ephraim and I over Facebook chats and WhatsApp. And it's really, really interesting because when Baghdadi Jews start leaving Baghdad, not for issues primarily of security, but because of economic opportunity in the 19th and early 20th century, they go mostly, as I said before, to India and later to East Asia and to London. They want to position themselves within a colonial context as being white Europeans. And they're very conscious of this whole issue of class. And at the same time, they don't want to be considered poor Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews, because you also have Russian Jews in particular in India and in East Asia. So who do they become close with as they're positioning their persona within, let's say, even global elites or within colonial administrations? Sephardic Jews. And there are two reasons for this. One is there are certainly questions of proximity culturally, religious traditions. And then there's, as I said, this kind of issue of Jews and whiteness, which has serious context within the Indian context. If you know anything about it in terms of rights, in terms of land rights, in terms of business rights, and the same as well as in China. So these two points come together. And then as well, especially in Shanghai and in Hong Kong, when the Iraqi Jews formally decide to become affiliated with the SMP community in London, this is a way to show their allegiance to the crown, of course. And it makes much more sense for them to join the SMP community opposed to the Ashkenazi community. So that's how kind of all of these things get wrapped up together. And then, in addition to that, Baghdadi Jews don't only marry other Baghdadi Jews. And so a couple of very prominent Baghdadi Jews marry into the SMP community. And the big example of this is Eli Kaduri, Sir Eli Kaduri, who marries Laura Mokata, which is a very prestigious SMP community from London. And her roots are from 1492, Spain and Portugal. And so in the, I guess it's now, I think it's in the 1930s. I'd have to go back and check the archives. The children of Laura and Eli even decide to build a Portuguese synagogue, an SMP synagogue in Porto in honor of their mother's origins. So you have people who are half SMP and half Baghdadi. And I think this further kind of cements the link between the two communities.
All right, thank you. I'm going to turn now to some of the questions that we have from participants. And one question we have from Esther, who's asking where the Iraqi Jewish archives is right now.
Oh, well, I feel like Maurice should answer this question because he really helped go through the archives.
Maurice, would you like to?
Yeah, the Iraqi Jewish archives are currently and has been since they were brought to the United States at the National Archives and Record Administration in Maryland, and which is called NARA, National Archives and Record Administration. And from time to time, NARA arranges exhibits in different cities in the United States where they show some of the archives of that period. So there are now, and still since day one, they were brought to the United States, they are in Maryland, US. Thanks.
Yeah. And I would also say that, so you can see, sometimes the archives go on display, but there's a very sturdy digital platform and you can search the archives. I worked in the digital archives for my research. It takes a little bit of time to learn how to find the documents, and you need to be patient because they're very high resolution, so it takes a little bit of time to download them. But if you're interested, and if you read Arabic, there's a portion in Arabic, a portion in Hebrew, some English, some French. It's really a treasure trove, and I think there's a lot more research to be done within the archives.
All right, thank you. And we have another question from Esther. Actually, in your book, do you write about the contributions from prominent rabbis such as Abdullah Somekh and the Ben Ish Chai?
So I touch upon that mostly in the context of their relationship with Jews in India and in the Far East, because a lot of them finance the yeshivot and also finance the publications of their books. But there's another scholar named Zvi Zohar who's written about rabbinic religious creativity. And if you're interested in that, I would say you should read his work because it's really amazing. There's some other people who write a little bit more about it. My touching on Ben Ish Chai and Abdullah Somekh really is how they fit into the larger picture of these networks. Because, for example, Ben Ish Chai, when he writes Kanun al-Nisa, the laws for women, he even in the introduction says, I'm writing these for the the Jewish women of Bavel, right? So Babylon, Bavel, and the women in the Hindustani provinces. So he sees these women as being part of his community. So that's kind of where I touch on that a little bit.
And since we're on that topic, can you also tell us a bit more about Rabbi David Papu, who was the chief rabbi of Baghdad around that time, and what that relationship was like, and his coming from, originally from, I guess, what would be modern day Turkey, moving into that area, and what kind of influence there was in the community.
Okay. So again, another person who I should probably mention is a writer named Jaron Harel, who wrote a really great book on intrigue, and I have to think of the title, on the rabbis in Baghdad up until 1914. What I can say about it is this. What's really interesting in Baghdad, and I think you see this in other communities, is you have the official chief rabbi, and you have the rabbis that people listen to from a spiritual perspective. And I talk about this a little bit in my book. And the position of chief rabbi is political. It's something that you don't really see in the United States, but you would certainly see in a place like France. And so I think David Papu is very much seen as a political figure who is brought in. And I can't talk too much about his long-term influence, but my understanding is that the two rabbis who were listened to and who were actually kind of calling the spiritual shots in Baghdad, certainly in the 19th century, were the Ben Ish Chai and Abdallah Somech. And later on, that gets more complicated because Sassoon Kaduri will become president of the community and chief rabbi, and he's very much a politician in many ways. And when we look at these chief rabbis in Baghdad, we need to think about them as community leaders in a certain political role. And that's why I suggest, and others suggest, that people like Abdallah Somech and the Ben Ish Chai stay away from holding that official role because they don't want to be politicians. They really want to focus on being rabbis.
Thank you. So we have a number of questions here. Try to combine them, all related to the Farhud. Mindy Reiser asking to explain the situation in Baghdad and what led up to the Farhud. Some Richard Siegel asking similar vein, who organized and fomented it. So maybe you could say a bit more about that. And I see another question here. Most of the Jews were forced to leave 10 years after the Farhud and gave up their Iraqi citizenship. Was the Farhud the beginning of the end?
Okay.
And so, if you can put that together for.
Sure. I can tie those together. So first, the Farhud. The Farhud happens in a context of not just anti-Jewish violence, but in a context of political instability within Iraq. And you have a tension in Iraqi politics between, let's say, a fascist, I don't know if right is the correct word, although sometimes people say right, which was certainly close to Nazi Germany. We're in a context of World War II. And then you have, let's say, a more moderate pro-British group, right? What happens is that the Nazi group, there's a great deal of tension. They ultimately, first the British leave, then the Nazis flee, and they're not Nazis, but they're, let's say, affiliated with them. And there's a moment where there's basically a coup, and nobody is running Baghdad. And the British decide not to go into Baghdad immediately. And some people say they did this because they knew that the population in Baghdad needed to let off steam, and this allowed them to let off steam by attacking Jews. It's not really corroborated, but we just don't know either way. But in this moment where there is no government in power, you have a group of army officers, of police with anti-Jewish sentiment who attack the Jewish community. And they attack the heart of the traditional community in the center of the city, and they attack the Jewish businesses in the city center. They don't attack the the middle-class Jews who live in the suburbs. And the reason they don't attack the middle-class Jews who live in the suburbs is because they can't tell the difference. They don't know who's a Jew and who's not a Jew, right? So it's organized, and usually say there are 2 days of violence, and then on the third day you have you have groups that come from the rural areas, and then they loot the houses. So it's 3 days of violence. And then the British come in and the government is restored and the regent is put back in place. And that's the end of the violence. Now, the link between the Farhud and the dissolution of the Jewish community, it's very hard to make that link because, as I said a little bit earlier, after the Farhud, the violence is recognized, actions are taken to make reparations, to show the Jewish community that this is being taken seriously, and there's a serious reduction in anti-Jewish in anti-Jewish sentiment and violence. Also, again, we're in World War II. The Jews of Baghdad, they're not going anywhere. You can't even go to India at this point. So they're in Baghdad. And then when the British come in and the British start winning World War II, Baghdad actually has a major economic boom, which benefits the Jewish community because of their commercial importance. Now, in the 1940s, there's a great deal of political instability in Iraq, which goes in waves. And these waves will continue, well, you could say until the 21st century. With the dissolution of the Jewish community between 1948 and 1952, this is, of course, very much linked to the creation of the State of Israel and paranoia from the Iraqi state that Jews are Zionist spies, that they're going to undermine the state. And there are anti-Jewish measures which are passed. Jews can no longer register in universities. Travel is prohibited or seriously limited. People can't get import and export licenses. So the Jewish community is very much paralyzed. There's an opening, I believe it's in 49 or 50, where Jews can register to leave if they renounce their citizenship. And the Iraqi government, by all accounts, doesn't expect so many Jews to register. And in a very quick succession, the majority of the community, but certainly not everybody, leaves. And that's something we're still trying to understand. But one of the things that I tend to think, thinking about these important networks, is that the Iraqi Jewish welfare state, right, because you don't have welfare in the traditional manner that we do in Europe or in North America, was very much tied to the Jewish community. So if the communal leaders were leaving and the community was suffering financially, all of those who depended on that communal infrastructure also decided to leave. But by all accounts, no one expected so many Jews to leave so quickly. Everybody has their own interpretations. Obviously, there was anti-Jewish violence. There were people who were put in prison for their work within the Zionist underground, but also people who were put in prison because they were communists. But of course, the most scary reason is that people were accused of things that weren't true. And so all of this uncertainty and uncertainty in the future, of course, is what prompted this dissolution. Of course, you also have around 10,000 Jews who stay in Iraq, and Maurice's family, of course, is one of them. And in the 50s, the position will improve slightly. And then again, you'll have waves where the situation is more problematic, and then it will improve. And in those moments, people will leave. But I guess by 67, the vast majority of the Jewish community has left.
And we have a couple of related questions. Well, you had mentioned compensation after the Farhud. Nabil Mohsin, who wants to know if there's some documentation related to that. And I think you've covered this a bit. Someone's asking what happened to Jews immediately after the Farhud, and also the long-term effect, which I think you've gone into already quite a bit. And I don't know if you wanted to say anything more about that. And also Mona and Mark Birch asked after the Farhud if there were any prosecutions by the authorities.
Yeah. Okay. So you can read the reports, the official reports of the Farhud. There's an English translation in Norman Stillman's The Jews of Arab Lands in Modern Times, where you can actually see the documents. And the documents may have been prepared in English and in Arabic simultaneously. So I would, let's see, it's on my bookshelf. Let's see. Well, I can't get it because I'm going to pull my computer down, but you can read the reports. If you read Arabic, you can go into the government documents from that period, and you can see how the Farhud was reported. But there was a trial, and there was a legal acts passed that documented this event. But again, I think it's very difficult to link the Farhud to the ultimate dissolution of the community. And of course, although I spoke about, the community in a very positive relationship with larger Iraqi society, there are certainly moments of tension in the 1920s and 1930s due to this position kind of at times between Europe and between the British and with the local Iraqi society. And that's not always related to Zionism. That's also related to questions of colonialism and independence, right? So there are multiple layers to all of these relationships, but because up until the very end, and even after Iraqi Jews left, they saw themselves as being Iraqi citizens. That's how, not everybody, of course, but if you read the autobiographies and biographies and letters of Iraqi Jews, they saw themselves as part of this society. So they were willing to temporize or to accept moments which were uneasy.
Solomon Bukhari wants to know if the Jewish hospital was destroyed or affected during that time.
During the Farhud or in the 50s? So during the Farhud, people were treated at the Jewish hospital. I don't know what happened to it after the majority of Jews left Iraq, but I would assume that the hospital just became a state hospital. Perhaps Maurice knows. I'd have to check, but
that's correct.
Yeah,
that's correct. It became an official hospital, belongs to the government, and no more Jewish hospitals in Iraq after 51.
Yeah. Which again would make sense because the whole very elaborate social welfare systems of schools, hospitals, charities, more or less, well, let's say didn't completely fall apart, but certainly shrank considerably to one school, one social club after 51, 52.
And I just want to add, there are a couple of people mentioning that they have a grandfather who experienced the Farhud, and we have Solomon Bukhari, and we also have Eli Amir. We have a question from Loretta Levy, and the question is, where did the Iraqi Jews move to?
So the majority of Iraqi Jews went to Israel, and that was really the only place that anybody could go. Also, we need to think about when this period of migration takes place, right? Between mostly 49 to 52. Europe is still in tatters from World War II. India is going through its own very painful partition, and China is extremely unstable due to the communists. So even the Baghdadis in India and the Far East are also leaving. Some people are able to go to London, some people go to Australia, some people are able to go to Canada or to North America, but that's very, very small. So most people go to Israel, and then after that, some people will move on. And those who make it to London usually make it to London because they marry somebody or they already have family there. So they start out in London, they start out in Israel, and then over the decades, some people leave and go elsewhere.
Thank you so much, Sasha. We're gonna conclude now. Thank you for taking us to Baghdad and beyond. We learned a lot today, and congratulations on the release of the new book.
Thank you so much.
Everyone here looks forward to getting into that. It's so important to remember these narratives as we are now at the 80th anniversary of the Farhud, and it is so important to remember not only that, but also over 2,600 years of vibrant Jewish life in Iraq. And thank you so much, Sasha. Your work helps us really to be able to appreciate a very important part of those over 2,600 years. We really appreciate all of your contributions, and thank you for speaking today. And thank you, Maurice, for moderating. And I would just like to thank again our co-hosts, the Tiferet Israel Congregation in Washington, D.C., CUNY, Brooklyn College, and Harif, Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And thanks to all of you for doing your part in keeping that history alive by being here, by participating, and by learning more. So we look forward to building on that and learning more together. Also, there's some that have joined us from Baghdad, and I hope that we can build on this and be able to move forward, brighter future. So to conclude, thank you, everyone. Thank you for participating, and see you for the next program.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Hi, Maurice. Say hello.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Hello to Yvonne and all my friends, Eli Hakak, Mira.
Yes, and I also like to say thank you so much, Yvonne, for all that you do at Tiferet Israel to keep the heritage alive. Yvonne's father from Baghdad, and also I'd like to thank Lynn Julius, who I know is also with us.
Can you repeat the name of the book?
It's Baghdadi Jewish Networks in the Age of Nationalism. I can ask Ephraim, even maybe on the Shin website, to post the information, and I have a discount code if somebody. It's a very dense book. It was really written for an academic audience, but I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you.
تاديني يا ولدي ليش تاديني يا ولدي ليش تاديني فراقك صعب يا هواي بالقلب جاويلي بالقلب